The morning sun cast long shadows across the broken city when Admiral Thex made the decision that would change everything. He had been reading reports about failed human colonies for 3 hours, and his head hurt from all the numbers and statistics. Most alien commanders would have simply marked the planet as uninhabitable and moved on to the next system. But something about the final transmission from New Detroit bothered him. "Sir, the transport is ready for planetary survey," his aide announced through the intercom. Lieutenant Crix had been with him for 5 years, and she knew better than to question his unusual interest in dead worlds. Still, her voice carried a hint of confusion. Admiral Thex stood up from his desk, his tall frame casting shadows across the star charts. His people, the Valorians, were known throughout the galaxy for their military precision and cold logic. They had built an empire that spanned 40 star systems, all through careful planning and ruthless efficiency. Emotions were considered. A weakness, and mercy was something only foolish species practiced. Yet here he was, preparing to visit a world that had been declared worthless by every economic survey team. The shuttle ride to New Detroit's surface took 40 minutes. Thex spent most of that time reviewing what little information they had about the remaining humans. Solar flares had destroyed most of the colony's technology 3 years ago. The government had evacuated everyone they could, but some people had refused to leave. Official records listed them as non-essential personnel, mostly orphans, elderly, people, and those too poor to afford transport to other worlds. "Beginning atmospheric entry," the pilot announced. Through the viewport, Thex could see the remains of what had once been a thriving city. Tall buildings stood like broken teeth against the sky, their windows dark and empty. Streets that once carried thousands of vehicles now grew wild with plants pushing through the concrete. But as they flew lower, Thex noticed something strange. Smoke was rising from several locations across the city. Not the black smoke of destruction, but the thin gray smoke of cooking fires. People were still alive down there. "Take us to Grid 7, he ordered. "I want to see what's happening in the residential sector." The pilot landed their shuttle in what used to be a park. Now it was mostly mud and scattered debris, but someone had planted a small garden near the center. Tomatoes and beans grew in neat rows, tended with obvious care. Thex stepped out of the shuttle, his boots crunching on broken glass and concrete. The air smelled of smoke and growing things. In the distance he could hear voices, human voices speaking in their quick musical language. "Sir, our sensors are picking up organized activity about 2 blocks north," Crix reported, checking her handheld scanner. "It appears to be some kind of gathering." They walked through the empty streets past abandoned cars and collapsed storefronts. But the closer they got to the voices, the more signs of life they saw. Someone had swept the debris from the sidewalks. Broken windows had been covered with pieces of colorful cloth. Small flowers grew in containers made from old cans and bottles. "This way," Thex said, following the sound of laughter. They found the source of the voices in what had once been the city's main library. Half the roof was gone, and most of the books had been destroyed by weather and time. But in the center of the main room, someone had created a small classroom. A young human woman sat on the floor, surrounded by 12 children of various ages. The oldest couldn't have been more than 14, and the youngest looked barely old enough to walk. All of them wore clothes that had been mended many times, and their faces showed the thinness that came from not having enough food. But their eyes were bright with attention as they listened to their teacher. "Now who can tell me what 7 times 8 equals?" the woman asked. She had brown hair that needed cutting and a face that might have been pretty if she hadn't been so thin. But when she smiled at the children, her whole face lit up with warmth. A boy with red hair raised his hand eagerly. 56. "Very good. David, and why is that important to know?" The boy thought for a moment. "Because if we find 8 cans of food, and we need to share them fairly among 7 people for 8 days, we need to know how much food that is?" Exactly right. Math isn't just numbers on paper. It's a tool that helps us solve real problems. Thex found himself moving closer, careful to stay hidden behind a pile of fallen books. In all his years of commanding fleets and conquering worlds, he had never seen anything quite like this. The woman had nothing, No technology, no resources, no support from any government or military. Yet she was teaching these children not just mathematics, but how to think. Now, the woman continued, let's talk about something even more important than math. Who can tell me what it means to be kind? A small girl with tangled blonde hair spoke up. It means being nice to people. That's part of it, Emma. But kindness is more than just being nice. Kindness means choosing to help others even when it's hard for you. It means sharing what you have, even when you don't have very much. One of the older boys looked skeptical. But Mira, what if people take advantage of you? What if you're kind to someone and they're mean back? The woman, Mira, nodded seriously. That's a very good question, Tom. Sometimes people do take advantage of kindness. But here's what I've learned. When you choose to be kind, you're not just helping other people. You're also choosing what kind of person you want to be. And that choice is always yours, no matter what anyone else does. Thex felt something strange happening in his chest. His people had built their civilization on the belief that strength came from power, that survival required defeating your enemies before they could defeat you. Yet here was this small human woman, teaching the opposite idea to children who had every reason to be bitter and angry. But how do we know if we're making the right choice? Asked Emma. Mira smiled that warm smile again. We ask ourselves a simple question. Will this choice help everyone be happier and healthier? If the answer is yes, then it's probably the right choice, even if it's difficult. At that moment, one of the smaller children noticed movement behind the pile of books. Mira, the child said calmly, there are aliens watching us. The other children looked around nervously, but Mira simply stood up and brushed the dust from her worn dress. She walked toward Thex's hiding place with steady steps, showing no fear. I don't know if you understand our language, she said clearly, but you're welcome to join us. We don't have much, but we're happy to share what we have. Admiral Thex, conqueror of 17 star systems and terror of 3 galactic sectors, stepped out from behind the pile of books. The small human woman looked up at his 7-foot frame and smiled as if she had been expecting him. The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither side was sure they should cross. Admiral Thex had faced down enemy fleets and negotiated with hostile alien species, but he had never encountered anything quite like this small human woman, who looked at him without fear. You are not afraid of me, he said finally, his voice coming out as a deep rumble through his translation device. Mira tilted her head slightly, considering his words. I'm terrified, she admitted with complete honesty. But fear doesn't help my students learn, and it doesn't make good decisions. So I choose to act with curiosity instead of fear. Behind her, the children had gathered in a tight group. Some were crying softly. Others clung to each other, but none of them ran away. They trusted their teacher, and their teacher was choosing to be brave. These children, Thex said, gesturing with one of his forearms, they are your offspring. In every way that matters, Mira replied firmly. The evacuation ships had limited space. Children without families got left behind because the officials decided they were non-priority. But every child is a priority. Every person matters. Lieutenant Crick stepped forward, her weapon scanning systems automatically analyzing potential threats. But Mira simply smiled at her too. You have lovely skin, Mira told Crix. The way the light patterns move across it is beautiful. Is that how your people show emotions? Crix's bioluminescent patches flickered in surprise. No human had ever complimented her appearance before. Most species found Valorian skin displays disturbing. Yes, Crix stammered. The patterns show our emotional states. How wonderful. It must make communication very honest. Would you like to sit down? I was just teaching the children about mathematics, but we could talk about other things, too. Thex found himself accepting the invitation before he had consciously decided to do so. Something about Mira's manner made it seem perfectly natural to sit cross-legged on the debris-covered floor of a ruined library, surrounded by human children who stared at him with wide eyes. This is Admiral Thex, Mira announced to her class. He comes from space and he's visiting our planet. What questions would you like to ask him? The questions came quickly. How fast does your ship go? Do you have families? What do you eat? Are there other aliens like you? Each question was answered patiently by Thex, who found himself genuinely interested in their curiosity. But it was the smallest child, a girl named Emma, who asked the question that stopped him short. Are you lonely? The library fell silent. Even Lieutenant Crix's light patterns stilled. In Valorian society, loneliness was not discussed. Strength meant self-sufficiency. Admitting to emotional needs was considered weakness. That's a very personal question, Emma, Mira said gently. Admiral Thex doesn't have to answer if he doesn't want to. But Thex was thinking about the question seriously. Was he lonely? He commanded thousands of soldiers, governed multiple worlds, attended countless meetings with other military leaders. Yet when he returned to his quarters each night, he often sat in silence, looking out at the stars and feeling empty. Yes, he said finally. Space is very large, and even with many people around me, sometimes I feel alone. Emma nodded as if this made perfect sense. We get lonely sometimes too, but Mira taught us that when we feel lonely, that's when we need to reach out to other people. She says loneliness is like hunger, but for friendship. That's very wise, Thex said, looking at Mira with new respect. Emma is the one who thought of that, Mira replied. I just helped her find the words for it. Children often understand important things better than adults do. What else do you teach them? Thex asked. Mira's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. Everything. I can. We start each day with mathematics and reading. Then we talk about science, how plants grow, why the weather changes, what makes the stars shine. In the afternoons, we discuss history and philosophy. Philosophy? Lieutenant Crix sounded surprised. You teach philosophy to children? Of course. They need to know how to think about difficult questions, like what makes an action right or wrong? How do we decide what's fair? What responsibilities do we have to each other? Tom, the older boy who had questioned kindness earlier, raised his hand. Tell them about the sharing problem, Mira. Ah, yes, Mira smiled. We were discussing a problem yesterday. Imagine there are two groups of people who both need water from the same river. Group A is stronger and could take all the water for themselves. What should they do? Take the water, Lieutenant Crix said immediately. Survival requires resources. The stronger group has earned their advantage. Several of the children looked shocked at this response, but Mira nodded thoughtfully. That's one way to think about it. And it's how many civilizations operate. But let's think about the consequences. If Group A takes all the water, what happens to Group B? They die, said David, the red-haired boy. And then what happens to Group A? The children thought about this. Emma spoke up first. They have to worry about other groups trying to take their water? Exactly. And they have to use energy and resources to protect what they've taken. Plus, they lose any knowledge or skills that Group B might have shared with them. But what if Group A shares the water? Tom asked. What if Group B decides to attack them anyway? That's the risk in cooperation, Mira acknowledged. Sometimes people do take advantage of kindness. But here's what's interesting. When you choose to cooperate, you often inspire cooperation in others. Not always, but often enough to make it worthwhile. Thex felt his worldview shifting in ways that made him uncomfortable. But surely in a universe of limited resources, competition is necessary for survival? Is it? Mira asked gently. Admiral, in your experience, do civilizations that conquer others tend to be happier? Do their people live better lives? The question hit Thex like a physical blow. He thought of the worlds his people had conquered, the constant military spending required to maintain their empire, the rebellion that always simmered just below the surface of occupied territories. He thought of his own people, proud and strong, but also isolated and fearful of showing weakness. No, he admitted. Conquest creates more enemies. Victory requires constant vigilance. Then maybe, Mira said softly, there's another way too. Think about survival. What if the strongest civilizations aren't the ones that conquer the most, but the ones that create the most cooperation? Young Emma tugged on Thex's arm. Admiral, do you want to stay for afternoon lessons? Mira is going to teach us about stars, and you probably know more about stars than anyone. Thex looked around at the circle of young faces, all looking at him with hope and curiosity. He thought about his duties, his scheduled meetings, the reports waiting on his desk. Then he thought about loneliness and the feeling of reaching out to others. Yes, he said, I would like that very much. 3 days had passed since Admiral Thex first discovered the makeshift classroom in the ruins of New Detroit. 3 days of the most unusual education he had ever received. Each morning, he found himself returning to the damaged library, drawn by something he couldn't quite name. Today, Mira had arranged the children in their usual circle, but she had also prepared a special lesson. On a piece of salvaged metal, she had scratched out a rough map of their local star system. Today we're going to talk about something very important, she announced to her eager students. We're going to learn about perspective. Young David raised his hand immediately. What's perspective? Perspective is understanding that the way you see things might be different from how someone else sees the same thing, Mira explained, and both views might be true at the same time. She pointed to her crude star map. For example, when we look up at the stars from here, what do we see? Little tiny lights, said Emma. Exactly. They look small and far away. But Admiral Thex, when you travel between those stars, what do they look like? Thex leaned forward, genuinely interested in this teaching method. They are massive balls of burning gas, some larger than your entire solar system. What looks tiny from here could destroy this planet with its heat if you got too close. The children's eyes grew wide. Tom looked up at the patch of sky visible through the broken roof. So the stars aren't really small? They're the biggest things in the universe, Thex said. But distance makes them appear small. Mira nodded approvingly. Now let's think about how this applies to people. Tom, when you look at Emma, what do you see? Tom studied his younger classmate. I see Emma. She's little and she asks lots of questions. Emma, what do you see when you look at yourself? Emma thought carefully. I see someone who wants to learn everything. I see someone who misses her parents but tries to be brave. I see someone who loves her friends. Both of you are right, Mira said. Tom sees Emma from the outside, so he notices her size and her curiosity. Emma sees herself from the inside, so she knows about her feelings and dreams. Neither view is wrong, but they're very different. Lieutenant Crix had been listening quietly, but now she spoke up. This is why military intelligence often fails. We observe enemy behavior from the outside, but we don't understand their internal motivations. Exactly. Mira's face lit up with excitement. Most conflicts happen because people don't try to understand each other's perspective. They assume everyone thinks the same way they do. She turned to address Thex directly. Admiral, when your people first encountered other species, how did they approach those meetings? Thex felt uncomfortable with the question, but he answered honestly. We evaluated their military strength, their resources, and their potential threat level. Then we decided whether to conquer them, form alliances, or avoid them. So you looked at them from your perspective, as potential enemies or resources? Yes, this is standard protocol for all spacefaring civilizations. But did you try to understand their perspective? Did you ask what they wanted, what they feared, what they valued? Thex paused. In 3 centuries of military service, he had never once considered this approach. No. We assumed they would act as we would act, seeking advantage and fearing weakness. Young David looked puzzled. But that seems silly. People aren't all the same. You're absolutely right, David, Mira said. But it's easy to forget that when we're afraid or when we feel threatened, fear makes us think everyone else is just like us. She stood up and walked to her star map. Let me tell you about something that happened here, before the solar flares destroyed our city. There were 2 neighborhoods, the Heights and the Valley. The Heights had more money and better houses. The Valley had more families and stronger community bonds. When the city started having budget problems, both neighborhoods wanted the government to spend money on them. The Heights said they deserved it because they paid more taxes. The valley said they needed it because they had more children to support. Tom raised his hand. What happened? They fought about it for months. Each side was sure the other side was being selfish and greedy. But then something interesting happened. A group of children from both neighborhoods started playing together, in the park between the heights and valley. Emma leaned forward eagerly. What did they do? They talked to each other. The children from the heights learned that many valley kids didn't have enough food at home. The children from the valley learned that many heights kids felt lonely because their parents worked all the time. So they found out they both had problems, David observed. Yes, but more than that. They found out their problems were connected. The heights parents worked long hours to pay high taxes, which made them stressed and absent. The valley families struggled financially partly because there weren't enough good jobs, which made them worried and tired. Thex was beginning to understand. So instead of competing for resources, they could have worked together to solve both problems. Exactly, and that's what they eventually did. The Heights families shared their connections and business knowledge to help create jobs in the valley. The valley families shared their strong community bonds and helped create support networks for the overworked Heights parents. Lieutenant Crix's bioluminescent patterns were flickering thoughtfully. The solution required both perspectives to work. Always, Mira said firmly. Real solutions almost always require multiple perspectives. That's why diversity isn't just nice. It's necessary for survival. She sat back down in the circle. Now, let's practice this. Admiral Thex, would you mind sharing something about how your people see the universe? Thex thought carefully. We see the universe as a dangerous place where strength determines survival. We believe that showing weakness invites attack, so we must always appear powerful and in control. And how has this perspective served your people? We have built a strong empire. We have advanced technology. We have never been conquered. Those are real achievements, Mira acknowledged. Now can you imagine how other species might see your people? This was much harder. Thex had never tried to view his own civilization from an outside perspective. They might see us as threatening? Possibly. What else? They might think we are cold, unfriendly. Go deeper, Mira encouraged, gently. If you were a small, peaceful species and you encountered the Valorians, what might you feel? The answer came to him suddenly, and it was deeply uncomfortable. They would feel fear. They would worry that we might attack them even if they did nothing wrong. They might avoid us, or they might band together with other species to protect themselves from us. And how might that affect the Valorians? It would make us more isolated, more distrusted. It would confirm our belief that the universe is dangerous because everyone would seem like a potential enemy. Mira nodded sadly. It becomes a circle. Fear creates the very dangers we're afraid of. Young Emma, who had been listening carefully to this adult conversation, raised her hand. So how do you break the circle? That, said Mira, is the most important question anyone can ask, and I think the answer starts with what we're doing right now. What's that? Asked Tom. Talking to each other, trying to understand different perspectives, being willing to be vulnerable enough to share our fears and hopes. She looked around the circle, meeting each person's eyes. Every person here sees the world differently. Admiral Thex sees it as a military commander. Lieutenant Crix sees it as a scientist and explorer. You children see it as young people trying to learn and grow. I see it as a teacher trying to help others. But right now, we're all sitting in the same circle, sharing the same conversation. We're creating something new, a perspective that includes all of our perspectives. Admiral Thex felt something profound shifting in his understanding of the universe. For the first time in his long life, he began to wonder what might be possible if beings throughout the galaxy could sit in circles like this one, sharing their different ways of seeing the stars. The morning alarm in Admiral Thex's personal quarters was designed to wake him gradually, with light that slowly brightened to simulate a natural sunrise. But today, he was already awake, staring out the viewport at the stars and thinking about perspective. For 7 days now, he had been spending his afternoons in the ruined library with Mira and her students. For 7 days, he had been learning things that no military academy had ever taught him. And for 7 days, his superiors had been growing increasingly concerned about his absence from normal duties. The communication came through at exactly 0800 hours, as he had expected it would. Admiral Thex, report to the command center immediately. Fleet Admiral Zorgan wishes to speak with you. Thex sighed and put on his dress uniform. He had known this conversation was coming, but he wasn't sure how to explain what he had discovered on the planet below. Fleet Admiral Zorgan materialized in the command center in a shimmer of transported energy, his massive form dominating the room. Zorgan was old, even by Valorian standards, and his scales bore the deep scars of countless battles. He was also Thex's mentor, the alien who had taught him everything about military strategy and command. Thex, Zorgan's voice carried the weight of command and disappointment. Explain yourself. You've been absent from your duties for a full week. Your staff reports that you've been socializing with primitive humans. I've been conducting a cultural assessment with significant strategic implications, Thex replied carefully. Strategic implications? Zorgan's four eyes narrowed dangerously. From refugees living in ruins? Sir, I believe I've discovered something that could change how we approach galactic civilization. For the next hour, Thex presented everything he had learned. He showed Zorgan recordings of Mira's lessons, detailed analyses of the children's psychological development, and most importantly, his observations about the community they had built from nothing. These humans have no technology, no military support, no resources from their government, Thex explained. Yet they've created something remarkable. Crime rate 0, mental health indicators, higher than most developed worlds, educational progress, exceeding standards of species with advanced technology. Survival behavior under extreme conditions, Zorgan dismissed. Nothing more. No, sir, I've studied their interactions carefully. This isn't desperation. It's a completely different approach to social organization, and it works better than anything we've achieved. Thex activated a holographic display showing comparative data from across the galaxy. Look at this, sir. Every major civilization shows the same patterns as they develop. Increasing crime rates, social fragmentation, mental health problems, resource conflicts. We've always assumed this was the natural price of progress. It is the natural price of progress. But what if it's not? Thex leaned forward intensely. What if the problem is that we've built our civilizations on fundamentally flawed assumptions? Competition instead of cooperation? Dominance instead of collaboration? Fear instead of trust? Zorgan was quiet for a long moment, studying the data displays. You're suggesting we overturn millions of years of evolutionary development based on the behavior of a handful of stranded humans? I'm suggesting we consider that evolution might have more than one successful strategy. Sir, what if we've been missing the most important survival trait of all? Which is the ability to create genuine community. The ability to put the welfare of others equal to your own welfare, not because you're forced to, but because you genuinely understand that everyone's welfare is connected. Zorgan's expression was unreadable. That sounds like the kind of idealistic nonsense that gets entire species conquered by more practical neighbors. Does it? Thex pulled up another set of data. Sir, I've run projections based on what I've observed. If we implemented these principles on just one colony world, just one, we could see dramatic improvements in every metric we care about. Productivity, innovation, citizen satisfaction, social stability. Theoretical projections. Then let me test them. Give me one world, sir. One failing colony where we have nothing to lose. Let me try implementing what I've learned. The argument was interrupted by urgent signals from the communication center. Fleet Admiral Zorgan, we have incoming ships. Multiple vessels approaching at high speed. Identify them, Zorgan ordered. Sir, they appear to be coalition enforcement vessels. They're requesting immediate transport of all human refugees for processing. Thex felt his blood run cold. Processing was a bureaucratic term that could mean anything from relocation to imprisonment to worse. Sir, those humans are not refugees. They're citizens of this world, living in their own home. They're non-essential personnel who refused evacuation, Zorgan corrected. The Coalition has decided they represent a health and safety risk. Through the viewports, they could see the Coalition ships taking positions around the planet. Thex knew what would happen next. Marines would be deployed, the humans would be rounded up, and Mira's little community would be scattered across the galaxy. Sir, I request permission to go to the surface and oversee the evacuation. Permission denied. You're too emotionally involved. Then I formally invoke Article 47 of the Coalition Charter, protection of indigenous cultural sites. Zorgan stared at him. You cannot be serious. I am completely serious, sir. What's happening on that planet represents a unique cultural development with significant scientific value. Those humans are conducting an active experiment in social organization that could benefit every species in the galaxy. It's a refugee camp, Thex. No, sir, it's a school. And what's being taught there is more valuable than any technology we might salvage. Down on the planet's surface, Mira was conducting the day's first lesson when the Coalition Marines landed. Thex watched through the ship's monitors as armed soldiers surrounded the library, their weapons ready but not yet pointed at the humans. But instead of panic or resistance, something extraordinary happened. Mira simply stood up, brushed the dust from her worn dress, and walked out to meet the soldiers. The children followed her, staying close but not hiding. Good morning, she said to the Marine commander. I'm Mira, and these are my students. We're honored to meet you. Would you like to join our class today? We're discussing conflict resolution. The Marine commander looked confused. His training had prepared him for resistance, fear, or desperate bargaining. He had no protocols for polite invitation to a math lesson. Ma'am, we're here to relocate you and the other civilians to processing centers for your own safety. I understand, Mira replied calmly. That's very kind of you to be concerned about our safety. But we're quite safe here, and we're in the middle of some very important learning. Could we perhaps finish today's lessons first? Young Emma stepped forward. Are you here to protect us? That's nice. Do you want to learn about perspective? It's really interesting. The Marine commander, a grizzled veteran of dozens of enforcement actions, found himself staring down at a small human child who was offering to teach him about perspective. Watching from orbit, Thex made a decision that would change the course of galactic history. Sir, he said to Zorgan, I formally request assignment to oversee cultural preservation on this world. If the Coalition wants to relocate these humans, they'll have to go through a proper assessment first. And if I refuse, then you'll have my resignation effective immediately. Zorgan studied his former student for a long moment. You're willing to throw away your entire career for these primitive humans? I'm willing to throw away my career for the chance to learn from them. Sir, what if they're not primitive at all? What if they've figured out something that all of our advanced civilizations have missed? On the surface, Mira had convinced the Marine commander to let the children finish their morning lesson before any relocations began. She was now teaching them about cooperation, using the current situation as a real-world example. Sometimes, she was saying, when there's a conflict between what different groups want, the solution isn't for one group to win and another to lose. Sometimes the solution is to find a way for everyone to get what they really need. Fleet Admiral Zorgan watched this scene for several minutes in silence. Then he turned to Thex. One world, he said finally. You have 2 standard years to prove your theories. If you fail, you'll be court-martialed for dereliction of duty. And if I succeed, then we'll discuss changing how the Coalition approaches first contact with developing civilizations. Thex felt hope and terror in equal measure. The human teacher comes with me. Her methods are the key to everything. Zorgan nodded slowly. Very well. But Thex, if this experiment fails, it won't just be your career that ends. It will be the end of any chance to try this approach again. Down on the planet, Mira had successfully negotiated a compromise with the Marines. They would return in 3 days, giving her time to prepare her students for whatever came next. As she gathered the children for their afternoon lesson, she looked up at the stars and wondered if, somewhere out there, other beings were also trying to figure out how to live together in peace. The world that Fleet Admiral Zorgon chose for Thex's experiment was called Terminus 7, and it was dying a slow, bureaucratic death. Located on the outer edge of Coalition space, it had been established as a mining colony 50 years earlier. The mines had played out after 30 years, leaving behind a population of mixed species with no clear purpose and no economic future. The official reports painted a grim picture. Crime rates were at 400% of Coalition standards. Mental health services were overwhelmed. 3 different species groups had formed territorial gangs that controlled different sections of the main city. The colonial government had requested emergency intervention twice in the past year, and there were serious discussions about forced relocation of the entire population. It was, in other words, the perfect test case for Mira's theories about cooperation and community. Admiral Thex stood in the command center of his new assignment, looking down at a world that resembled a wound in space. The main city sprawled across a valley like an infection, its lights dim and irregular. Smoke rose from several districts where conflicts were currently burning themselves out. Beside him, Mira was reading the colonial reports with the same careful attention she had once given to teaching mathematics in a ruined library. She had been quiet during the journey from New Detroit, spending most of her time observing how the ship's crew interacted with each other. Now, faced with the reality of Terminus 7, she looked thoughtful rather than overwhelmed. "What do you see?" Thex asked her. "I see a lot of pain," she said simply, "and a lot of people who have forgotten how to trust each other. The colonial administrator wants to meet with us immediately," Lieutenant Crix reported. "He's requesting military assistance to restore order to the mining districts." "No," Mira said firmly. "That's not where we start." Thex was surprised by her certainty. "Where do we start?" "With the children. There's a school system here, right? Multiple species probably segregated by the ethnic conflicts?" Crix checked her datapad. 3 separate school systems, actually. The hegemony families send their children to private academies. The trader families have their own cultural education centers. The human settlers use the old colonial schools. "Perfect," Mira smiled. "That's where we begin." The shuttle ride to Terminus 7's surface took them through an atmosphere thick with industrial pollution and social tension. The spaceport was heavily fortified, with security checkpoints between different sections of the city. Armed guards watched everyone with suspicious eyes, and the few pedestrians moved quickly, avoiding eye contact. Colonial Administrator Beck met them at the government complex, a tired-looking human man whose uniform showed the stress of trying to govern an ungovernable situation. "Admiral Thex, thank the stars you're here," Beck said, his voice carrying desperate relief. "We need martial law declared immediately. The gang violence in Sectors 4 and 7 has reached critical levels. Yesterday alone, we had 16 incidents of interspecies conflict." "Tell me about the schools," Mira interjected before Thex could respond. Beck looked confused. "The schools? Ma'am, we have much more urgent priorities than education right now." "Do we?" Mira asked gently. "How long have these conflicts been going on?" 15 years, maybe 20. It started small, just economic competition between different groups, but it's escalated. And in all that time, have military responses or increased security made the situation better or worse? Beck was quiet for a moment. "Worse, I suppose. Every crackdown just makes the groups more defensive, more isolated from each other. So maybe it's time to try something different. Tell me about the children. Are they fighting too?" "Well, no. The kids mostly stay within their own communities, but they absorb the attitudes of their parents, which means they learn that other species are enemies before they even have a chance to form their own opinions," Mira finished. "What if we gave them a different chance?" Over the next 3 hours, Mira outlined her plan to an increasingly skeptical group of colonial officials. She wanted to create integrated community centers in neutral zones throughout the city. The centers would offer educational programs that mixed children from all 3 species groups, focusing not just on academic subjects but on conflict resolution, emotional intelligence, and cooperative problem-solving. "It's impossible," declared Chief of Security Major Reynolds. "The parents will never allow it. The cultural differences are too great. The hegemony families consider mixing with other species to be contamination of their bloodlines, added Education Director Torres. And the trader clans have religious prohibitions against their children learning from non-trader teachers, Beck concluded. Mira listened to each objection patiently, then asked a simple question. What do all parents want for their children? Safety, Reynolds answered immediately. Success, added Torres. Happiness, said Beck. Exactly, and right now, none of their children have any of those things. The hegemony children live in gated compounds, afraid to leave their own neighborhoods. The trader children are being raised to continue economic conflicts that are destroying their families' businesses. The human children are growing up in a world where their future looks hopeless. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the sprawling city below. But what if we offered them something different? What if we created spaces where children could learn together, play together, and discover that they have more in common than they have differences? They'll never. Come, Major Reynolds insisted. Then we'll go to them, Mira replied. We'll start small, street corners, parks, anywhere children naturally gather. We'll bring books, games, simple science experiments. We'll make learning fun and collaborative. Admiral Thex had been listening quietly, but now he spoke up. What would you need to make this work? Mira's eyes lit up with the same enthusiasm he remembered from the ruined library on New Detroit. Teachers, not just any teachers, but people who understand that education is about more than transferring information. People who can help children discover their own capacity for kindness and cooperation. I can provide security for your teachers, Thexy offered. No, Mira said firmly. No uniforms, no weapons, no show of force. The moment this looks like a military operation, we lose the trust of everyone we're trying to reach. Then how do you protect your people? The same way I protected my students on New Detroit, by making it clear that we're not a threat to anyone, that we're not trying to take anything away from any group, and that we genuinely care about all the children equally. Beck looked skeptical. And if the gangs decide you're interfering with their territory, then we invite them to participate too. Most gang members are barely adults themselves. They joined gangs because gangs offered them belonging, purpose, and protection that legitimate society failed to provide. She turned back to face the room. Look, I know this sounds idealistic. I know you've all tried other approaches and they haven't worked. But what if the reason they haven't worked is because they were based on the assumption that conflict is inevitable? What if conflict isn't inevitable at all? Over the following weeks, Mira began her experiment. She started with a single folding table in the Central Market, the one place where all three communities had to interact for basic commerce. Every day she set up simple learning activities, math puzzles, science demonstrations, storytelling sessions, and waited to see who would come. The first week, only human children approached her table, and only when their parents weren't watching. The second week, a few young traders stopped to watch her chemistry experiments, intrigued despite themselves. By the third week, she had attracted a small but regular group of mixed-species children who came to her table every afternoon after regular school hours. The breakthrough came in the fourth week, when a fight broke out in the market between hegemony and trader adults over pricing disputes. While the adults shouted at each other in multiple languages, their children instinctively gathered around Mira's table, seeking a safe space away from the conflict. "What's happening?" asked a young hegemony girl named Vera, her scaled skin flushed. With anxiety. "The grown-ups are having a disagreement about fairness," Mira explained calmly. "Sometimes when people feel scared or angry, they forget how to talk to each other respectfully. My father says traders always cheat," said another child. "And my uncle says hegemony people think they're better than everyone else," replied a young trader boy. "What do you think?" Mira asked. "When you watch each other here at this table, do you see cheaters or people who think they're better than you?" The children looked around at each other. They had been playing cooperative games and solving puzzles together for weeks now. They had shared snacks and helped each other with difficult problems. The idea that they were supposed to be enemies seemed suddenly absurd. "Keto helped me with the math problem yesterday," Vera said, pointing to the trader boy. "And Vera shared her lunch with me when I forgot mine," Cato replied. "So maybe," Mira suggested gently, The grown-ups are wrong about some things. That afternoon, when the parents came to collect their children from the market, they found them sitting in a circle, playing a cooperative storytelling game where each child added one sentence to build a shared adventure. For the first time in years, children from all three communities were laughing together. By the end of the first month, Mira had expanded to 3 different locations. By the end of the second month, she had trained 12 local volunteers to help run the programs. By the end of the third month, something remarkable was happening. Crime rates in the districts with community learning centers had dropped by 60%. Interspecies conflicts had decreased by 40%. And for the first time in 15 years, there were reports of families from different communities socializing together. Admiral Thex received these statistics in his monthly report to Fleet Admiral Zorgon, along with a personal note. "The children are teaching their parents," he wrote. "When a hegemony child comes home excited about a project they completed with a trader friend, it becomes much harder for the parents to maintain their prejudices. When human children share stories about the fascinating cultural traditions their new alien classmates have taught them, fear begins to transform into curiosity." But the real test came 6 months into the experiment, when the mining consortium announced they were closing the last operating mine on Terminus 7. 1,500 jobs would disappear, and with them, the last economic foundation of the colony. In the past, such news would have triggered riots as each community blamed the others for their misfortune and fought over the remaining resources. This time, something different happened. The children who had been attending Mira's programs went home and asked their parents a simple question. What if we all worked together to find a solution? What followed was the first inter-community planning meeting in the colony's history. Representatives from all 3 groups sat down together to discuss their common challenges and explore cooperative solutions. They discovered that the hegemony families had connections to galactic trade networks. The trader clans had expertise in resource management and logistics. The human settlers had agricultural knowledge and manufacturing skills. Within 3 months, they had established a cooperative agricultural program, a small manufacturing cooperative specializing in artisanal goods for the luxury market, and a cultural tourism initiative that attracted visitors from across the galaxy who wanted to experience genuine interspecies cooperation. Terminus 7 went from a failing colony scheduled for evacuation to a model community that otherworlds began studying and emulating. When Thex's final report reached Fleet Admiral Zorgon, it contained data that challenged fundamental assumptions about galactic civilization. Crime rates had dropped to below coalition averages. Mental health indicators had improved by 300%. Economic productivity had increased by 150%. Most remarkably, citizen satisfaction surveys showed the highest happiness levels recorded in any coalition colony. But perhaps most significant of all was the final paragraph of Thex's report. The transformation of Terminus 7 demonstrates that cooperation is not just a nice ideal, but a practical strategy for survival and prosperity. The human teacher Mira has shown us that the universe is not inherently hostile, but that hostility is often the result of fear, misunderstanding, and the assumption that conflict is inevitable. By teaching beings to understand each other's perspectives, to communicate across differences, and to work together for common goals, we can create communities that are stronger, happier, and more innovative than any built on competition and domination. I recommend immediate implementation of these educational approaches on all coalition worlds, beginning with our most troubled colonies. The return on investment is not just measurable, but transformational. Most respectfully, Admiral Thex, Commander of Terminus 7, and grateful student of a remarkable human teacher who reminded an old soldier that kindness is not weakness, but the strongest force in the universe. The report was classified at the highest levels, but somehow copies found their way to teachers, community organizers, and dreamers across known space. And slowly, quietly, the galaxy began to change, one classroom at a time.